Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for coming. My name is Arif Lalani, and I'm head of the policy staff at the Department of Foreign Affairs and International Trade here in Canada. And I wanted to welcome you all to this roundtable discussion on middle powers and evolving global governance. I also wanted to thank our co-sponsors for this roundtable, the Centre for International Governance Innovation in Waterloo, Canada. I just wanted to say about 2 or 3 things before I introduce our panel. First, this really is an exercise by the Department of Foreign Affairs and International Trade in what we're calling open policy development, which basically says that we don't have all the good ideas and that we should engage with all of you from the outset as we're developing our ideas. So our presence here and our co-hosting and sponsoring of this panel and others or global shift. And the shift is not simply from one set of states to another. That's a rather important shift, and I think a number of our speakers today will talk about that. Or from a set of one institutions to another. That's another important factor of the shift. But there's also a shift, I think, in what are the determinants of power and influence? And that is shifting in some ways from more traditional, conventional means to others. Whether that is the influence of ideas, or whether that is so-called smart power or soft power, whatever you would like to call it. And I think we're seeing some of that debate play out in a very literal sense on the streets of the Middle East and North Africa over the last few weeks in terms of power, how it's wielded, who wields it, and what is the impact, and also what is the response of the international community in a time of transformation. As we look at that environment, there are some who argue that the existing institutions of the post-World War II era are now suffering from a representation gap, but also a gap in terms of the issues and the themes that they are addressing. And I think that's something that our panelists will also be looking at. And others would argue, and this is I think where we get to the heart of the policy issue for us as practitioners, that the new institutions, the new forces of power and the new dynamics maybe threaten or jeopardize so-called middle powers like Canada and others and their influence and their ability to pursue their interests. Some, I hope, on this panel will argue that in fact if we pursue the right mix of policies and build the right capacity, we can in fact have greater influence and ability to pursue our interests. So we're really looking forward to getting at some of that with the panelists. So with that, let me introduce our panelists. They will each have about 10 or 15 minutes to speak. If required, I will signal to each of you that you have 3 minutes and then 1 minute. And then I'm not sure what form of power or influence I might use to get you to the next speaker. I'll innovate or I'll adapt. Let me introduce our panel. Dr. Andrew Cooper was a distinguished fellow at the Centre for International Governance Innovation. He is professor of political science at the University of Waterloo, where he teaches in the areas of international political economy, global governance, and comparative politics. He's a member of the International Advisory Board of both the Garnett Network of Excellence and the Hague Journal of Diplomacy, and he will cover in broad strokes, I think, a discussion around reform and innovation of existing institutions. Dr. Amitav Acharya is Professor of International Relations in the School of International Service at the American University in Washington, D.C. His previous appointments include as Professor and Deputy Director and Head of Research of the Institute of Defense and Strategic Studies at Nanyang Technological University in Singapore, as Professor at York University in Toronto, as a Fellow of the Harvard University Asia Center, and a Senior Fellow at Harvard's John F. Kennedy School of Government. And he was also Vice President-elect of the International Studies Association in 2008 and 2009. And he will cover regional governance and particularly a perspective on Asia. Dr. Yongrin Mo is a professor of international political economy. He served as the Dean of Underwood International College at Yonsei University. He's also a research fellow at the Hoover Institution. And prior to joining Yonsei, he was an assistant professor of government at the University of Texas at Austin and he will be covering the evolution of the G20, amongst other things. Dr. Rohinton Medora is the Vice President, Program and Partnership Branch at the International Development Research Center. He joined IDRC in 1992. He's held the position of Assistant Professor of Economics, University of Toronto. He has also worked at the International Monetary Fund in Washington and consulted for the World Bank Economic Development Institute. And he will be speaking about networks, ideas, and innovation. And I think you can see the narrative coming together. And finally, our discussant will be Mr. Paul Heinbecker, who is a distinguished fellow also at the Center for International Governance Innovation. He's also the inaugural director of the Laurier University Center for Global Relations, a career diplomat who served in Turkey, Sweden, the Canadian delegation to the OECD, as in Paris, Washington, as ambassador to Germany, and most recently as our ambassador to the United Nations at a time when we were on the Security Council. He is also at CG. I guess I'm wondering whether it's a coincidence or not, Paul, but you are launching your own playbook, separate from RIM's playbook that's coming out. But Paul has just authored a book called Getting Back in the Game, a foreign policy playbook. And that ends the plug for that book. But I'm looking forward to all of the comments and the discussion. So with that, Dr. Cooper.
I don't know if you're allowed to talk about your sort of first academic love, but thinking about middle powers, in some ways, this is my first academic love. In the post-Cold War era, I wrote a lot about middle powers. I wrote a book with colleagues, one of whom Amitabh knows well, Richard Higgett, on relocating middle powers. I did a number of articles, one on spent too long on agricultural trade, on Cairns Group in IO, fellowship in Political Science Quarterly, a number of other works that tried to sort of recraft middle power diplomacy away from some of the normative hangovers from the past, and trying to sort of do it a bit more conceptually, and trying to sort of balance sort of middle power overall, sort of stabilizer, even to some extent followership in the international system, with a range of styles. And I think this sort of led, I think, to some very innovative work that was sort of passed down to other people. The era that we're in now is very different. I think in the post-Cold War era, there seemed to be enormous space for middle powers. There didn't seem to be very many checks. There seemed to be also a lot of rising middle powers, countries that were very willing to identify themselves and to play by certain playbook rules. What we're seeing now, of course, is at least in theory and maybe in practice, squeezing of middle powers. We're also, of course, seeing rise of different acronyms, whether you call them BRICS, whether you call them, just a China-India consortium. But it's not just at the top that we're seeing this type of activity. What is really interesting to me is that we're also sort of seeing rising small powers. And I think even in conjunction to some of the more sort of central institutional components, we see sort of reactions by small countries. And I think the 3Gs are interesting, where you see, I guess, small in size, but certainly not small in resources and capabilities. Qatar, Switzerland, Singapore, and so on. So in some ways, it's a very good time to sort of see whether this type of squeezing sort of pushes middle powers away, or in a sense allows some sort of rejuvenation of middle powers in sort of a different way, perhaps in some ways less sort of club approach to middle powers, maybe to some extent much more sort of networked. At the same time, we should appreciate the difficulties. The EU sort of presents a different sort of structural concern, still some room for activity, but at the same time, I think the EU shows that perhaps the traditional middle powers, at least from Europe, are a different breed today. And indeed, it's probably the country that Canada has seen as sort of more classically middle power in recent years has been a non-EU country, Norway. So again, I think we have to sort of settle down and see whether there's sort of room, space for middle power. Certainly at the declaratory level there is. I mean, it's interesting in Canada, Prime Minister Harper, certainly a well-known speech in 2007 to the Council on Foreign Relations, sort of talked about the need to position Canada as a middle power in a different way, and we can sort of get on to this. And of course, even though he's not Prime Minister anymore, but still Foreign Minister, Kevin Rudd in Australia has been an interesting proponent of the middle power, talking about creative middle power diplomacy. And in some ways, I think in that regard, work on Australia, particularly favouring Labour Party activism on middle power, is quite reflective. Different approaches on middle powers. One, of course, is somewhat, and maybe just to provoke Paul a bit. You know, can we? Not that he needs too much provoking, but careful. Can we see something like Afghanistan as sort of a super niche for middle powers? Certainly, I think if you look at Prime Minister Harper's language in 2007, Afghanistan seems to be a pretty predictable case where you would see sort of middle power, talking about middle power sort of, you know, stepping up, you know, delivering in terms of action, stepping to the plate, to use a sort of an analogy. And in some ways, of course, I think the subtext on this is the sense that playing and this type of super niche in Afghanistan is very different from these other niches of the past, the International Criminal Court, the landmines, small arms, child soldiers, and something. So I think there's an interesting narrative there. And even though the generals don't like niche sort of language, I think there's even a certain acceptance of, you know, if you go and call it a niche and this allows the military to do what they want, they'll accept this type of translation from declaratory to operational. The other, and of course we'll hear more about this, is not so much Canada sort of out ahead trying to link declaratory to operational, but sort of a reactive approach to G20. And here, of course, the whole constellation between the G8 and the G20. Canada, of course, is in an interesting sort of position, as you all know, sort of being a hybrid in this regard, having this G8 position still, you know, very different from sort of the classic middle powers. What is Canada going to do with this? We see sort of, in that regard, classic niche behavior, right, at G8. At least in some components of it, both in terms of the initiative on maternal health. I mean, some controversy, of course, at home about how this was developed, but still, it does seem to be a classic niche targeting an MGG that was sort of falling behind. With this, of course, food security as well, and it's interesting that Canada sort of pushes this at L'Aquila and puts money on the table for food security. The real interesting thing to me, though, and it fits into the introduction, is that this isn't sort of only the classic sort of club middle power. What, of course, is interesting in both of these initiatives is the Gates Foundation. And of course, if you didn't have the Gates sort of giving the niche sort of more, not just sort of credibility in certain circles, but of course sheer resources. And in this regard, I guess you could sort of ask the question, you know, very boldly. And we just had, and IDRC supported it, a major conference in Ottawa on sort of new diplomacy on the weekend, on Monday and Tuesday. And I sort of asked, well, you know, if we're talking about a new diplomacy, do you have to actually privilege the Gates Foundation as a middle power, or at least a diplomatic power? I mean, they certainly have more resources than most middle powers. They have institutions. Go to Geneva, see their building, bigger. And of course, they outweigh the WHO in terms of spending in many years, and certainly all middle powers in terms of, or most middle powers in terms of spending. So certainly that's interesting. But of course, with this, and we'll hear more on the Korean contribution, is that despite this sort of the unique component of Canada, what we're seeing is a new wave of middle powers. And this is sort of coming from a completely different direction than we would have seen in the past. Sure enough, Australia is still in the mix. But I think what's probably much more interesting in terms of the G20 is whether this sort of second layer of countries within the G20 can play a role very similar to the European middle powers in the past, some of the countries that we would have seen as sort of aspirant middle powers in the past. And of course, Korea stands out, and in some ways their activities in the G20 in Seoul sort of play to the sort of niche component, development, but I think even financial security, safety net type of activities. And certainly I think in terms of their own sort of Sherpa diplomacy, quiet diplomacy, sort of you can see sort of Korea developing. I think even though I don't think psychologically Korea has been a middle power in the past, I think you're beginning to get a bit of the playbook of G20. Two big questions in terms of countries, though. An article a year or so ago talked about a Käte group. And of course, this Käte group put Korea in the mix, but it also sort of added one old middle power, Australia, but of course a new middle power, an aspirant, Indonesia. It's interesting. I get the sense, and maybe Amitabh will know this more, you know, there's a debate now in Indonesia about whether Indonesia should sort of play this role. And in some ways, I think it's a role that comes from a certain frustration with ASEAN. But also, of course, it comes from that G20 role. And in some ways, I think you see a classic sort of two-level game in this regard. One is that if you're going to be a credible G20, you have to have a diplomacy that in some ways reflects that role, that status. And I don't know if you've seen that in Indonesia. But also, I think on the other side, if you're going to be a G20, you have to play certain sort of global governance issues at home. And I hear from individuals that even on things like forestry, that has been a problematic sort of sore for Indonesia. Indonesia sort of reflects this and crafts this type of policy. Well, if we're a G20, we have to sort of have better rules at home in terms of this type of policy, which I think would be an interesting. I mean, maybe we're taking this too far. And of course, not taking it too far is, again, to provoke Paul a little bit, Turkey. You know, it's probably the one country that nobody really puts into the mix, because in some ways it seems to be all over the map. And again, Dries, who's in the room, has sort of written about this. But what seems to me is that even though I tried to do a nice little diagram many years ago about what a middle power would look like and the stylistic diplomacy, in some ways Turkey seems to be doing everything in that diagram. You know, in some ways it's a robust middle power. Even if, according to some people, heroic. It's out there with Brazil and Iran. In some ways, of course, it's got a very quiet style of diplomacy, technically astute. Certainly, Turkey has done well on the IFIs, IMF. It's being able to lever its position. I mean, remember Turkey, you know, as sort of the sick man, right? Always going to the IFIs in the past, the IMF, and now all of a sudden Turkey has been elevated in the IMF along with the sort of the BRICS. And at the same time, we see it's a different sort of concept of middle power than I have, but certainly Turkey is the bridging country. Turkey seems to be bridging everywhere, you know, and again, according to your definition of bridges, but certainly Turkey is interesting in this regard. So what we have, we go back to political science and international relations. Robert Cox, sort of at York University, wrote an article many years ago about middle powers, even though I don't think he sort of is somebody that spends a huge amount of time on middle powers. But he did make the interesting comment that it's an evolving process. You can never sort of have a fixed idea about what a middle power is. It's always sort of a project in evolution. And I think this is the fascinating thing about middle powers now, is that it is in evolution. We're beginning to sort of see a new sort of wave, I think, structured by the G20. In some ways, we're caught between our fascination and perhaps some worries about the BRICS. But at the same time, we still see that sort of hold, perhaps an unanticipated hold, on the G7, G8. So this is what is going to be interesting. The interesting, of course, is that whether we're going to have sort of loose fishes in terms of middle power, where in a sense middle powers just do their own thing and sort of follow some sort of script about their own interests to some values, but we really don't see any sort of coordination where, you know, sort of Korea acts as a middle power, Indonesia, perhaps Turkey, and of course Canada, or whether we're beginning to see some sort of almost forced organization. And here, it's probably, if we do see organization, it will be through the G20, because at some time, if the G20 actually works fairly effectively, there's going to be sort of pressure to do hosting functions. I mean, already, of course, we're going to see this in Mexico. I mean, does Mexico sort of play out as sort of a middle power? Does it create sort of niches in 2012? There's going to be a lot of priorities to do this. Not to sort of be too general, not to sort of just come back and have another Cancun conference on climate change. It's going to have to sort of get in and really do detailed work. The other, of course, and this sort of gets into other work I'm interested in, is who sort of gets invited in as sort of other representatives in G20. Do you actually bring in countries that support you on particular niches? And I think Mexico, talking to officials, they're already thinking about this. They're thinking about which countries are sort of the consultative countries would actually support them, not just because they want to have representation from a certain group or a certain individual, but to give that sort of animation, to give that amplifier force. And of course, with that, you're going to see some sort of loose sort of networks where the middle powers, almost by force, are going to have to start working together within the G20 construct because they want to differentiate themselves. They want to differentiate themselves from the old G7, and of course, they want to differentiate themselves from the BRICS as well. Thank you.
Now, let me start by saying what we already know about Asian regional institutions, so that I don't want to repeat or elaborate on them. So what is the conventional or existing wisdom on Asian regional institutions, how they operate? And there are 5 sort of elements to our knowledge, our understanding of Asian institutions. First of all, they are relatively new, but I say relatively because ASEAN has been around since 1967, so it's almost 45 years. And APEC, the next major institution in the region, was created almost 22 years ago. The ASEAN Regional Forum was in 1994, that's already kind of close to 20. And the East Asian Summit, which is the most recent one, was 2005, among the big institutions. And then is the ASEAN +3 and other institutions, but let's say among the bigger institutions, they are still relatively new compared to the European Union, compared to NATO. There is never, there wasn't, and there is not a NATO in Asia, but even compared to the African Union, compared to certainly the OAS and the League of Arab States, Asia is relatively late in the game. There are a lot of reasons for it, and I can recommend my book to read on this, whose ideas matter, but I will not do that. The second understanding we have that we already know is that these institutions are weakly institutionalized and legalized. Or they, the jargon is that they're under-institutionalized, and they tend to take a non-legalistic approach. Now, what I mean by under-institutionalized is that they don't have the European Union kind of structure or of governance, big secretariat with a supranational European Commission, and 3 presidents, not knowing what each of them does, and representatives, ambassadors, and the like. It's more informal. So we have concepts like the ASEAN way to sort of talk about how Asian institutions perform, both in a positive but also sometimes in a critical sense. Third, the Asian or Asia-Pacific institutions are seen as deliberative rather than problem-solving. They're brainstorming types. Sometimes they're derided as talk shops, and that is to some extent a valid criticism, although as a constructivist I would say talk shops do matter. But still, I think they're not institutions that allocate resources, if you talk in terms of the academic literature on the institutions. But they basically have a brainstorming function, trying to consult with each other. The Chinese used to say, but still say, that Asian institutions are consultative, not problem-solving. They should not do things like conflict resolution, but they should elaborate on approaches to conflicts. And that's basically what is in the ASEAN Regional Forum concept paper, thanks to Chinese insistence. And that is true, especially in political security institutions or institutions with that kind of role, like ARF, to some extent East Asian Summit, although it's a new beast, we don't know how it's going to go. But economic institutions are a little better, probably, but not that much better. I mean, with the exception of things like Chiang Mai process, which is an outgrowth of the ASEAN +3 in the financial realm, and ASEAN's own free trade area, which is a little more institutionalized and does have a dispute settlement mechanism. But in general, Asian institutions are deliberative and they are brainstorming, their function is more of brainstorming rather than problem solving. Fourth point is that they are led by ASEAN, which is a group of weak states. Now this is of course the central feature of the regional architecture of East Asia or Asia Pacific, that this is a region that locates physically or in terms of a de facto residential presence all the major powers of the international system. That includes the United States, European Union as a collectivity, and of course Russia, China, and Japan, and India. So all the major powers are represented in groups like ARF. But this group is led not by the great big powers, or for that matter by middle powers, but by the relatively weaker states, the coalition of the weaker states. You can talk about ASEAN as a group being a middle power, but I'll come back to that later because the middle power concept is problematic here. But that is often seen by realists as a contradiction. How can a bunch of weak states provide leadership to all the major powers of the international system? Simple by power calculation, this is not going to work. But that's again a matter of contention and debate. And the fifth and the final feature of Asian institutions that we know about is that they are sovereignty bound, sovereignty conforming. They have a strong attachment to sovereignty and non-intervention. They are not sovereignty challenging, not to mention supranational. They don't go too much beyond state sovereignty. That might be changing somewhat a little bit, but not much. Now let me sort of try to explain, make some comments about whether these features that I outlined are remaining as they are, or they are changing, or they're likely to change. Now, here my general point is that they're changing a bit, but not much. Asian regional institutional architecture is remarkably what I call path-dependent. They change, but very gradually in a very evolutionary way rather than in a revolutionary way. Now, there have been some developments that we should take into account. One is that existing institutions have expanded their agenda. For example, the ASEAN Regional Forum was created as a confidence-building forum to deal with traditional interstate issues. So there's China and its neighbors, or US and China, like a little bit like the OSCE model minus its human security or human rights agenda. But today the ARF is dealing with a whole bunch of transnational issues, including terrorist financing and even some extent non-traditional security issues. Disaster relief, one of the big recent activities of the ARF that Americans are very interested in is humanitarian disaster assistance exercises. So it's become gone from being an interstate kind of conflict-oriented grouping to a transnational threat-oriented grouping. We also have ASEAN taken on a lot of new roles which it didn't have before, beginning in 1992 when it took on the security role formally for the first time. But now ASEAN deals with terrorism. It has a declaration on climate change. It has a declaration on population, disaster relief, pandemics. You name it. There's not a single issue area that you can think of that ASEAN doesn't have a declaration on, or that it has action, there's something different. But there's a broadening of the agenda. And the East Asia Summit, which is the new kid in the block, may well be the same. Its agenda remains very unclear, but it's going to take both traditional and non-traditional threats, at least from the American point of view. The US government certainly sees it as doing both kinds of issues in the security realm. How far it will go is something we would not know for some time, but at least that's the plan. And then we have, of course, in the ASEAN Plus 3 and the Chiang Mai Initiative, financial cooperation, which was until recently, until 1997-8, financial crisis was never a part of the regional cooperation agenda. But that is now one of the most significant part of the regional cooperation agenda, with the multilateralization of the Chiang Mai process with the currency swap agreements and the creation of kind of a secretariat of the CMI in Singapore. We are seeing actually institutionalized vehicle for financial cooperation, which the region did not have before. So there's been expansion of agenda, expansion of the scope, functional scope of these institutions. There is also movement we have I mentioned also new institutions have come up. I mean, this is kind of a cliche that Asians create a new institution whenever they can't think of a better solution. And the East Asia Summit is kind of the most recent example of that. There's a lot of controversy about whether the East Asian Summit was necessary. Why can't we do the same things within existing institutions like APEC or ARF? And I think Kevin muddied the waters quite a bit, and a good example of what a middle power should not do by going ahead and making this fantastic proposal of an Asia-Pacific community without consulting any country in the region. And of course, I learned his lesson when the proposal was thrown out of the window, summarily, and I have absolutely no hope of being revived. Well, if you would say it's only Singapore, then you're giving Singapore too much credit. I think they were quite hostile to it for a good reason, but they were hostile to one element of it. That is the concept of power element of the Asia-Pacific community. If Kevin hadn't talked about the concept, I think he'd still probably have some purchase to his proposal. Then finally, there has been movement within ASEAN itself. And for whatever one might say about ASEAN as a top shop, it's doing nothing, this is one institution that really does something. It moves in some way. The most recent example is Indonesian mediation and the decision of Indonesia, the chairman of ASEAN, to send a team of observers to the Thai-Cambodian border to monitor a ceasefire between Thailand and Burma, which have got into this fight over the pre-Bihar temple. Now this is really unprecedented. And Indonesia a few years ago proposed an ASEAN peacekeeping force, and the peacekeeping force idea was shut down again by Singapore. But the idea lived on, and now in reality you see that this is not the European Union sending monitors to Aceh as they did. This is ASEAN itself, or an ASEAN member. This is consistent with ASEAN Charter Article 19, which mandates the ASEAN Secretary General or the ASEAN Chair of the ASEAN Planning Committee to do good offices mediation, and the Indonesians did that. So that is important. ASEAN's changing stance towards Burma or Myanmar is also important. A few years ago that will not be even talked about. Now they have openly condemned Myanmar in the 2007, the saffron uprising. And when the Buddhist monks rose up against the Burmese regime, ASEAN condemned the violence committed by one of its members, again unprecedented. So despite all this, penchant for sovereignty and non-interference, ASEAN is moving to some extent. But again, it's not a fantastic shift. This is very path-dependent and gradual. Another development I should mention is that ASEAN's own leadership is being challenged. Now this is a structural issue. I go back to the idea that how can a bunch of weak powers lead all the big powers of the international system which are represented in the region. Now in reality what has happened is, the ASEAN itself, as you know, the real concern is not the United States or Japan, it's China and India, because ASEAN's geographic location, its history, is to be sandwiched between India and China. By the way, Southeast Asia is often said as south of China and east of India. And it's traditionally part of the trading route, and Singaporeans and others realize that their fate has always been to be somewhat caught up in the interaction between India and China, and then the history is repeating itself. It was created in 1967. That was a time when India was out of the game because of the India-China war. India was marginalized, had no credibility after organizing the Bandung Conference and Asian Relations Conference, all the big events. And China was mired in this cultural revolution and also was seen as the rogue of the region for supporting communist insurgencies. So ASEAN prospered at a time when both India and China, for whatever, out of their own will or out of circumstances they could not control, were out of the game in Asia, diplomatically. But today both are rising, and those days both are also weak countries economically. Today they're rising powers, and they're back in the game. They're in the diplomatic game. So this is very important. This is not in the United States or Japan or any other country. The real concern in ASEAN is how they're going to relate to these two neighbors, whose signature imprint is right there on the doorstep. And of course, culturally, we also know that India and China have major cultural influences in the region. So this might actually undermine ASEAN's leadership. To ASEAN's advantage, however, that the big powers of Asia-Pacific somewhat cancel each other out. They cannot agree on their own leadership. Chinese will not accept the Japanese leadership and vice versa, and Chinese will not like Indian leadership, and India will not like Chinese leadership. So because the great powers are not in agreement, there is absolutely no prospect whatsoever of an Asian concert of powers among the great powers. So ASEAN still has this space where it can at least set the agenda. But I always think of ASEAN not as the leader of Asian regionalism, but as the kind of a hub where people congregate and people come to because it's the it's a rather pleasant place rather than being in a hostile atmosphere. So if you have the ARF meeting all the time in China or India or Japan, that'll create its own sensitivities and dynamics. So my time is up. You didn't give me a 3-minute notice.
I gave you 3 and 1.
Okay, you did? I didn't see that. Now, having said that, if I could take 2 more minutes, very quickly I would like to say about middle powers and Canada. What role Canada and middle powers should play in this? I think the concept of middle power to me is obsolete. I mean, I think Andy made the point about how much space they had during the Cold War period, but now we simply living in the world has changed too much. I'm to give you one example. I mean, what do you call a country like India? Is it a great power, a middle power, or a regional power, or a weak state? What do you call a country like Indonesia? What do you call a country like South Korea, which is obsessed with, it has to be for practical reasons, with its own security neighborhood? And I have a lot more to say on this. Japan, I mean, I've seen articles on Japan as a middle power, and Japan is now an emerging power, and Japan is one a global power. I think these categories, one of the things we need to do as the world changes, we also need to rethink our terminology or categories. Otherwise, there will be no real change, because concepts and terminology matter. So the uncertain status of this middle power category is a problem for all the middle powers, including Canada. But there is also the question of uncertain motivation, and here is where Canada comes in directly. Canada has lost status and relevance in Asia, especially in Asian regional architecture. I mean, I can give you many examples, because I was very front and center involved in the North Pacific Cooperative Security Dialogue at York University, which we actually ran for DFAT for many years. Paul Evans, David DeWitt, and I was involved. And Canada was the first country to create an ASEAN Center, by the way. When I came to North America, I created an ASEAN Center, and we call it the first ASEAN Center outside of ASEAN. But in fact, I worked with the Canada ASEAN Center in Singapore. That was in early 1990s, way before ASEAN was even seen relevant. So this was a country that was ahead of the game, but now it's behind the game, and it needs to get back into the game. And I was telling Paul that in my little handbook, I had actually written that phrase. Canada needs to get back to the game, and in my case, of course, Asia, in your case, globally. And how it can do so, I mean, there are many ways of looking at it. But I would say that forget about being a middle power. Focus on some areas where Canada can really contribute. Of course, this is a political question as much as in the capacity of the foreign affairs staff or people. But I think one of the things Canada should do is to take advantage of its diaspora. UN Power of the Asia-Pacific Foundation is having a kind of a dialogue, or planning to launch a dialogue using the substantial Asian community in Canada and civil society to participate in policy making, create the political atmosphere for big engagement, the official engagement of Canada in the region, and I think it's a great idea. And there are many other things I would be happy to answer when there's a question and answer. I'm sorry I've taken up more than what I should have.
Leadership in multilateral cooperation. I'll use the case of G20 to show this. And middle powers such as Canada and South Korea, G20, and who are strategically located, right, between large developed countries and large developing countries. And large developed countries are represented by G7, and BRICS represent large developing countries. And they two countries have played a very important role at the G20. Now, I guess Canada was the founding father of the G20. And South Korea, I think, deserve a lot of credit credit for maintaining G20 momentum after historic London summit in April 2009. And people at the time wasn't very optimistic about the future of G20, but South Korea, as a chair country for 2010, has worked very hard to make G20 effective and meaningful, in my view. So, in making my case, I answer 5 questions, and which follows. The first question is the G20 getting stronger, and my answer here is yes. The second question is strong G20 good for the world, the global governance? my answer is yes. The third question is, why is the G20 getting stronger? Here, I think the role of middle power, I think, has been overlooked. So I emphasize the contributions the middle powers have made in making G20 stronger. Fourth question is, why is middle power getting more important at the G20 and beyond? Because I would argue that changes in the international system, power transition and power diffusion, favor a middle powers over, not always, but especially multilateral cooperation, and favors middle powers over other categories of powers. And my last question is, what's the future of middle power leadership in multilateral cooperation? So I'm narrowing my analysis to areas of global issues and multilateral cooperation. Here I see 3 threats to their leadership, and I'll explain that later. So let me go review each question. And so G20 getting stronger. Now, a lot of people you will find more pessimists than optimists on the G20. I can spend a lot of time on this question, but for lack of time, I will just say that we have to differentiate G20 as an institution and from the G20 as a policy outcome. I think that G20 leaders can do a better job, everyone agrees, but the G20 as an institution, but that does not mean that we should reject the G20 as an institution, but a lot of critics of G20 are confused between these two concepts, that we don't really have an alternative to the G20 and getting BRICS involved and other middle powers involved in economic global governance. And my second question then is this G20, strong G20 good for global governance? Now here again, of course G20 is not a perfect solution, and the question we have to ask is that whether G20 is better than alternatives. Now, if we do not have the G20, we are not going to go back to the UN or universal multilateralism. What we'll go back to is the pre-G20 era, where there are many small number groups like G7, then there are small number groups, a governance group in every issue area. And what's happening is that these small number groups are being consolidated around the G20. So if you accept that the smaller the number of small number groups, the better for global governance, then I think that the consolidation of the small number groups around the G20 is a positive development for global governance. So my point here again is that we are not going to go back to G7. We are not going to go back to we are not going to go back to United Nations. So the alternative seems to be the only decent alternative we have is G20, and that's why I think it's good for a global governance. My third question is, why is G20 getting stronger? Now, a most obvious answer is, again, there's no alternative to the G20. And then now the institutional dynamics of G20, now as the G20 is now in the third year, 2008, 9, 10, or no, fourth year, and as more countries get to host the G20, there are more enthusiasm among member countries. And then there are other institutional features of the G20 that make G20 fairly popular, the Troika system, the steering committee, as a way of getting more countries involved in a leadership role. But I'd like to say here is that the middle power did a lot. Canada, for example, it was the Canada's idea to start the G20, and South Korea, from the very beginning, saw a big opportunity in the G20 and was involved very early on, actually, even before the London summit. And actually, the chairman of our organizing committee, Dr. Sagong-il, claims that he's the one who persuaded Larry Summers to take G20 more seriously. So that he claims credit for the huge stimulus package that they agreed on in G20 in London. So, and then from the very beginning, South Korean government wanted to institutionalize the G20, and they finally got that in Pittsburgh when the leaders agreed to to meet annually thereafter. So it's a big achievement, because if you look at the history of G7, it wasn't until 8 years after the first G7 meeting that the G7 leaders decided to annualize the G7 meeting officially. So it just took more than a year for G20 leaders to institutionalize G20, which was a big achievement, and South Korean leaders played a very important role in persuading other G20 leaders to do that. And South Korea, as the host of the Seoul Summit, made a number of contributions in terms of agenda setting, coalition building, and outreach activities. I'm not going to get into the details. I think Andy mentioned a few of them already. And the fourth question, which I guess I'll have to spend more time, which is most relevant for my my task. So why is middle power leadership getting more important in multilateral cooperation? Now, South Korea, for example, is the G20 just the first example where we are asked to assume more responsibility for global affairs. But later this year, South Korea will host the OECD, a high-level forum on aid effectiveness. So it's a huge event. And next year, we'll host April, I think, the second nuclear summit. And South Korea is lobbying to host the 18th UN Climate Change Conference in 2012. So, although very new to this area, South Korea is very ambitious, and it's trying very hard to make a difference. And the question is then, why is South Korea first of all so interested in this in global leadership, middle power leadership? A lot has to do with the personal leadership style of President Lee Myung-bak. And he was a former businessman, won a lot of contracts in the Middle East when he headed the Hyundai heavy engineering or construction company in the 1970s. So he's one of the very rare South Korean leaders who sees an international market as an opportunity, and his business mind applies to diplomacy, and he thinks that South Korea has a lot to gain from playing a role in global leadership. And personally, I'm kind of worried whether the next president will carry on this legacy, but I'm hopeful that South Korea will do. And South Koreans, I think that what they are trying to do is that they think they have, a lot of strength as a middle power. And at the G20, of course, their strength varies across issue areas, but for economic governance, for development, they think that they are the most recent, they are most recently developed country, meaning that, well, I don't know whether if you count Singapore and Hong Kong, but among decent-sized countries, South Korea is one of the first one or two countries that made a successful transition to democracy and the market economy in the 20th century. So they think that their development experience is more relevant for developing countries, because that the wealthy countries developed in the 19th century or early 20th century, so their knowledge is fairly old. But South Korea, who just succeeded in the last 3 or 4 decades, must have a lot of knowledge and expertise. Now, I'm not sure but if that's the case, but anyway, they think that they can reach out to developing country based on their recent development experience. And their other strength is that they invested heavily in global education. A lot of South Korean students went abroad, and a lot of bureaucrats went abroad. So in carrying out these leadership roles, especially at the G20, South Korea had a lot of talented bureaucrats, senior level bureaucrats who, as far as I know, did a very good job of managing the G20 summit. And South Korea has a lot of, in many areas, as people who are educated abroad, and so in better position to exercise leadership than other, let's say, new middle power countries. And South Korea also is very confident about their culture because South Korean popular culture is very popular in Asia, and so that might have been another factor. Speak for themselves and that project their power based on their soft power. And but it's not just South Korea, but there are other middle powers, right? As I said, the power transition. If you think about how power transition from developed countries and developing countries, so obviously these middle powers in this context of position, right, that between the two large developed countries and the large developing countries, I think can certainly play a role in mediating the conflict between the two large groups. And even power division, right? Power division to non-state actors, and that favors countries who can put together coalitions very fast. And you might say the great powers have all these network powers and soft powers, probably more than middle powers. But then again, their size and their history sometimes work against great powers. So for many issues, the middle powers are more adaptable, agile, and more flexible. So not in all issues, but in some issues, middle powers can be more effective in utilizing new forms of power than great powers. So what's the future of a middle power leadership? Now, for South Korea, I told you, I said already that maybe a next president may not be as enthusiastic about global leadership than the President Lee. But in the long run, a South Korean nationalism may play a role because we are not yet comfortable with the idea of a middle power. Many Koreans think that they are a great power. Well, I think the same is true for Canada. As I read the literature, and I don't think there's a consensus within Canada. I think more consensus on the role, the position of Canada's position as a middle power. But there are people, like who argue that even in Canada, that Canada should be a principal power. Principal power sounds like more, not a great power, principal power. But the same is true in Korea. That the Koreans, many Koreans are much more ambitious. I don't think they will be happy, just satisfied, content to be a middle power. That worries me. And also democratization of G20. Now they are debating whether they will introduce a constituency system. Now then, G7 and then BRICS are safe no matter what kind of system they use, but the middle powers that the G20 will lose out. They will lose their permanent seat and under the constituency system. So, and this for the next 5 years, for the foreseeable future, I think that to groom the new middle powers, that G20 should stay with the current system and then should start the constituency system much later. That's my preference. And my third threat to middle power leadership is this: what everyone talks about, the G2 world, China and the United States. That can be a self-fulfilling prophecy, and I see that everywhere. That where I go to the United States, come to Canada, everyone talks about China. And of course, if we think like that, it'll become true. And in the G2 world, I don't know what kind of room that middle powers have in making a difference. So these are some of the thoughts I have on the task that was given to me. Thank you.
I'd like to sort of thank the sponsors of this panel for having me on it, and to thank Arif for having organized us and our thoughts in some ways. The subtopic that's been sort of assigned to me in the global topic of middle powers and global governance is the power of networks, ideas, and innovations. And I thought what I'd do in my 10 to 15 minutes is make 3 blocks of observations. One, a set of contextual issues to frame what we mean by words that can be awfully plastic. Second, to focus on networks and the role of Canada in particular in them, but by implication, deriving lessons for other such countries. And third, to look ahead to what this might mean in the world of ideas and decision making. So for me, the starting point would be three things. The first would be if I take a single factoid from a couple of UNESCO reports that have been out for the past few months on global science. It is that knowledge and science is now being produced much more in a much more decentralized way than previously. The salient statistic here is that 20 years ago, 95% of global science, however measured, patents, copyrights, citations, was produced in the usual countries of US, Canada, Western Europe, Japan, 95%. Today that figure is closer to 75%. And the increase has been entirely in a category of countries that you would all recognize as emerging economies, middle powers, call it what you will. So clearly there's something going on here. Second, blindingly obvious but worth stating, the cost of access to information and the cost of information has decreased dramatically. So there is an ICT's revolution. In my view, this is much more about communications having become costless. I don't believe that the costs of computing and the costs of accessing really good analysis have come down quite as dramatically, but it is still worth making the point that access to the internet is almost ubiquitous globally these days. And so my third observation here would be in some ways that a multipolar world is both a cause and a consequence of these kinds of developments. In other words, that this is a self-reinforcing trend which is not going to end anytime soon. As science becomes produced globally and as information becomes costless, more countries can participate in this game. And as more countries can participate in this game, science becomes even more global. This, therefore, leads naturally to sort of thoughts about how middle powers can make a disproportionate contribution to global governance. And here I think we need to separate three things. One, I'm quite willing to accept the proposition that in this kind of world, networks, informal or even formal structured networks, will play much more of a role rather than formal structured institutions that are run by hegemonic coercion. I'll come back to that in a second. But that's a proposition that I think that's defensible. Second, this presentation is not about, although I think it's an important academic issue, this presentation is not so much about what do we mean by middle powers. I think it's important in some ways, but for this discussion, I don't care whether Egypt and Nigeria belong to the G20 or not. I don't think it matters if Chile were a more effective member than Argentina in the G20. These are all hugely important issues, but my point is that if you saw a list based on certain criteria of economic, military, and scientific prowess, a list of about 30, 35 countries, we'd all buy into that list, and that's what we're talking about here. And so my third sort of result from all of this is what do we mean by networks? Networks, in my view, lie somewhere between formal, structured bricks and mortar institutions on the one hand, and sort of informal professional associations and almost blog posts on the other. But as such, networks face many of the same questions that, in fact, formal institutions do. You can have different kinds of networks, a point I'll come back to in a few seconds. But networks are sort of streams in which ideas can be introduced. Ideas can be refined and nuanced. They can be areas or spaces where decisions are taken. And networks can be every bit as government-run as institutions, or every bit as people-run as NGOs. In fact, we know from the literature that there are proponents of both kinds of networks, and both can be correct. As such, networks also face many of the same dilemmas that you would recognize as being institutional. What is the objective of a network? How should membership be defined and, in fact, maintained over time? How open, closed, or controlled should the operations of a network be? And finally, what should the governance of a network look like? By which I mean, plainly speaking, who runs it? Who makes the rules? What kind of secretariat or node is at the center of a network? These are all sort of live issues, and there is no single answer to it. Next, then, I'd like to move to sort of two broad areas where I think networks are playing a role and might perhaps play a role that's even more defined in future. You know, if you sort of think of the range of issues in global governance that we face, my colleagues on the panel have mostly talked about what I call great game kinds of issues, you know, really big things. What would you do with global warming? What would you do in Libya? Kinds of issues. All fair points. I do think that there's a second class of issues also on which networks are hugely important, and that's the next tier of issues, and this is where ideas and innovation come in. And I'd sort of define it this way, that there are some problems for which the technical solutions are known, but they are contested, and so there's a role for mediation of ideas and a mediation of power, so that in some ways a broadly correct solution emerges. And then you've got a second class of global problems, and mostly these lie in the areas of energy and health, science more broadly, where the technical solutions themselves are not known. And here the challenge for networks is to provoke the right context within which the good science emerges, and then from that, the good governance for that science emerges. Now, if we go to that first category of issues, where the answers have been known for some time, but they just weren't being used. The example I'd give you is a really small one relative to what all of my colleagues have been talking about so on, which is economic policy in Africa. And there has been a networked institution in which Canada, along with others, including foundations, have played a key role, is the African Economic Research Consortium. And so this began as a professional association 25 years ago, has now become a very well-established power, not just on the continent, but with the IFIs and others who deal with African economics, bankers and others. As a result of a generation of investments, you now find that central banks, finance ministries, and think tanks literally around the world contain graduates of this institution. And so if there's one reason that African economic policies are much more sophisticated and are homegrown today, I'd say, and they are, by the way, arguably one reason is because of this kind of foundational investment that several, frankly, middle powers and non-governmental actors made in this forum. More broadly, I'd make the point that if we have a much more sophisticated understanding that is now being applied on things like capital controls, it isn't because the key institution that was responsible for this area did all the thinking, or that the really important countries did all the thinking on doing all this. In fact, I think it's despite these institutions that we find ourselves having a much more nuanced view. And that nuanced view emerged after the East Asian crisis. After the East Asian crisis, again, you had a reasonably loose network of central bankers and finance ministers who came together in the rubric of the then G20. That's what led to some very charged discussions on exactly what we meant by capital mobility and financial sector policies. And if you then sort of project forward to today, some of the institutional change that you're seeing, still very slow and still very tentative, on these issues through the IMF and the BIS, is because of these kinds of network functions, where a small group of people get together almost as equals. I say almost as equals because power is not absent in these kinds of discussions. And then technocratically sort of thought through, had a good information base behind them, and have brought us to where we are today. Instance of funding and of other kinds of intellectual support on a reasonably technocratic approach to the problem to be solved, on a lack of mission creep in some ways, and finally, the disproportionate role that middle powers, both countries as well as, and Andrew made the point that isn't the Gates Foundation a middle power? Right. That these kinds of middle power funders, non-governmental funders, have played. And so I think we're increasingly seeing a set of necessary but not sufficient conditions emerge for successful networks of this kind. to exist. And the question really becomes, might we see more of these in other areas of endeavor? We shall see. The second set of issues on which I think networks can and are playing a role is the one I said, where the solutions themselves don't exist. And again, I'll give you two quick examples where Canada has played a leading role. The first is in something called the Development Innovation Fund, which was announced by the government about 3 years ago. And what this is a large amount of money that's set aside using what's called a grand challenges approach. Doesn't matter what that means. Essentially, it is to say you identify a bottleneck in whether it's global health or energy or agriculture or anything else, and invite the best propositions from around the world and fund them correctly to address that bottleneck, so that a small amount of research investment then opens up an avenue of decision-making that's much wider. This is based on an approach that, in fact, yet again, the Gates Foundation has pioneered in the area of global health. Canada correctly feels that there are refinements that can be made to the approach to recognize that you don't just have to fund the science, but then also all the issues related to IP, rollout, and the governance of science around it, what my colleagues call from the lab to the village. And second, that these kinds of scientific networks don't have to be overwhelmingly dominated by American, sometimes Canadian, and Western European scientists. That's been a critique of the Gates approach, which I think the Canadian approach is successfully addressing. The second area in which small and middle countries can make a difference is in the so-called advanced market commitment, which began really as a paper by Michael Kramer. And the idea here is to say that science has an incentive problem. You're not going to spend, if you're a private sector laboratory, tons of money inventing something for which the market is really, really poor people who may not have the capacity to buy your product. And so the advanced market commitment is a pool of funds that are set aside early on to entice industry to say, should you produce such and such a thing, we have already banked the money so that the market is created for you. And so it's a contract between private sector, so producers and public funds to address a global issue. Who were the 5 initiators of the advanced market, the only AMC that we have, which is on pneumococcal vaccines, as it turns out? They were Canada. The need at the time was $1.5 billion. Canada was among the first to put in $200 million of that, already disproportionate. And the other funders were, in fact, Italy, Russia, one other country, that Norway, the UK, and the Gates Foundation. And you might want to think of the AMC as a really good idea that, in fact, has been rolled out through this middle power and other approach. And ask yourself, why not AMCs for issues to do with agriculture? Why not AMCs for issues to do with green technology? It is possible. And this, again, is my idea of what a middle power network approach might yield. So let me end then with sort of 3 or 4 observations on where all of this might be leading. My first question, and these are all questions because it's not as if we have answers to these things. This is still early days in this area, is that it doesn't follow from all of this, and I'm sure people like Arif were in a day-to-day position here, that the only way that middle powers will have influence in future is through networks. Nor does it follow that networks are only successful if middle powers play a role. One can think of topics such as nuclear non-proliferation, in which even in a network, ultimately what will matter is the views of 2 or 3 really important countries. And similarly, one can think of middle powers who choose to do things entirely on their own because values and interests or simply interests coincide, and the network approach is too constrained. That's okay. So network solutions are going to be a subset of the solutions as middle powers look ahead. Second, as I said, some networks are going to look a lot like highly undemocratic institutions, but that's okay. That's okay because in my view what matters is the bandwidth around them. The bandwidth around, frankly, the way the IMF conducted its business in the last 3 decades was really narrow. Now let's assume that that bandwidth increases and let's assume that the IMF is now one player among several, along with the Financial Stability Board and others, to regulate global finance. That starts looking like a network solution, but it's still going to be dominated by a few players, and we have to accept that. Third point, as some of my colleagues have mentioned, a bellwether of whether this is all going somewhere might well be how the G20 in quote secretariat looks. I know that there's some mid-level, middle to advanced discussions on how the G20 should organize its secretariat. My own vote would go for something that's light, that is in fact networked, in which think tanks are used from around the world by a very light secretariat within the G20 to then create dispassionate position papers so that when the leaders get together, they have the issues on really complicated issues, whether it's climate change or financial regulation or anything else, on which they can then determine their deliberations. I think one reason that the finance G20 didn't work as well as it did was its secretariat ended up being the IMF and one or two institutions which were already constrained by their governance structure. And my fourth and final point, on which I will end, is that as you will see from the kinds of examples I've given you, I'm not clear that middle powers and networks can necessarily play a role to solve a really hot crisis, unless they've made foundational investments and contextual investments previously. I think middle powers and networks can only play a role over the long run. You know, I gave you the example of African economics, 2.5 decades. I think some of these investments will take time, but once they're in place, they will be deep and they will be sort of powerful enough that they will be part of an important solution to an important problem. Thank you very much.
Thank you. There's a lot to agree with in all of that. A few general and a couple of specific comments, I guess. On the general comment, it's for practitioners, it's always painful to watch political science trying to adapt its theories to fit reality. All the talk we've heard today about middle power just strikes me as being silly, and I think that we should dispense with the idea. I agree with my partner here in crime about getting back in the game. You know, why don't we say 2.0 powers, or constructive powers, or cooperative powers, or creative powers, or emerging powers, second-tier powers. The idea of middle powers is it's just sort of, it's becoming intellectually impossible, and further, it's limiting. I don't see this as an empowering kind of notion. This is a limiting notion. This is, you know, you can't do things inherently because you're a middle power. And a middle power, you know, the idea made sense in 1945 when there were 51 members of the UN. You could be a middle power and be 25th. There's 192 countries now in the world. So when you walk around saying you're a middle power, what are you saying about yourself? We're number 96. How does that help in the creation of the disposition to do something? When you think that you're so, you know, you're basically, when you call yourself a middle power, you're calling yourself irrelevant these days. So that's one general comment. A more specific comment as we go along. The G20 as a network. The G20 is going to die of boredom if the finance departments remain in control of the G20. Leaders are not going to put up with having to talk about stuff that's so arcane, with one or two exceptions, possibly ours. But I mean, you really have to kind of wake up in the morning thinking about economics. So what happens is you take all of these leaders. First of all, you've got a tower of, we've got a Babelian problem. And you've got 20 countries, about half at least of which have to rely on translation. You have different cultures, you have different ideas about what you're talking about. But you can't, you know, you say we're going to talk about finance, it's going to have an impact on the value of our currency, it's going to make big differences in our financial situation. And so you're going to use talking points. What you're getting in the G20, and here I disagree a little bit. I think the G20 is beginning to become weighted down. You're going to get people stating positions, not seeking solutions. Maybe that's what the Chinese would like to see. Maybe it should be consultative and it should never actually arrive at an outcome. I don't know. But when you're telling heads of government that the things they say are so technical and have financial consequences, they tend to read their talking points to each other. And what do you get out of that? You get people coming together for a day and a half and hearing other people's talking points and then going home again. Well, there's some benefit in that. But there's also some risk. I think if the G20 doesn't do what the G8 did, which is to say, we have these important leaders together, the world's got some important problems. Let's start to get some common ground on these kinds of on these serious problems. That we're going to end up, with a process that could only make finance ministries happy. G2. I don't think there'll be a G2. I'm just doing some random things here. There won't be a G2 for the same reason that there isn't a G5 and there isn't a G7 and there isn't a G8 anymore. And that's because it's not enough. The rationale for for going to G20 was not to include China only. It was because India mattered, Brazil mattered, and increasingly places like Turkey and Indonesia and Korea mattered. So the idea that you can then retreat back to a G2 and that somehow the G2 will be powerful enough to coerce the rest of the world into following its direction, I think is wrong. I'm way closer to Rohinton when he's talking about 30 countries than I think about 2. One of the things that I don't understand when I'm listening to the discussion, and I find it very interesting. I think, in fact, we could have had an entire session just on networks. I think that would have been probably also good in retrospect. What's a network exactly? I think the definition is actually matters. Is the UN a network? Do countries belong to networks? When Anne-Marie Slaughter first started talking about networks, she was talking about judges and scientists, and she wasn't talking about governments actually. So now we're starting to think of networks as governments. So as the G20 as a network. I think Rohinton has said because it doesn't have a secretariat, and that's there are views on that, but I think I come down on the side that there shouldn't be such a secretariat, but one can argue that. And then the question of we talked about private-public participation, which I think is very important, and the Gates Foundation is very important, but where's the other Gates? What other foundation is it? I don't know of a Carlos Slim Foundation. I don't know of some other foundation. Ted Turner saved the UN's budget with a very large transfusion of money once. So there's that. But I think we have to be a little bit careful when we start talking about the advisability of mixing the states and the private institutions when there's really so far only one private institution. It's a terrific example, but I'm not sure that it's going to be replicated all over the place. Maybe it is. So long and short, I think that it's, I guess, one last comment, and that is the difference between international affairs and foreign policy. There's a tendency to think that everybody is involved. The world is changing, and everybody's involved and they are involved in international relations or in interpersonal relations across state borders. But they're not necessarily involved in foreign policy, which is still the domain of government. In one of these papers, it said that governments are still the instrument that you use when you try to accomplish something international. I don't know whose paper I read it, maybe it was yours, but some of them, or some papers. So, we don't, I'm losing my train of thought here. Maybe that's a sign that we should stop it. But I think that at the end of the day, we have to be a little cautious on on downplaying the nation state. Yes, the world is changing. Yes, there are lots of other people who are changing and God knows in the Middle East it's happened in spades, where the context is changed by participation of people other than governments. How that affects a country like Canada, to my mind, is really not very clear. It changes the context in which we operate. I'm not sure the extent to which it changes how we operate. Maybe more exploration needed.
Thanks. Thanks, Paul. Thanks very much, and thank you to all our panelists. Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for coming. My name is Arif Lalani, and I'm head of the policy staff at the Department of Foreign Affairs and International Trade here in Canada. And I wanted to welcome you all to this roundtable discussion on middle powers and evolving global governance. I also wanted to thank our co-sponsors for this roundtable, the Centre for International Governance Innovation in Waterloo, Canada. I just wanted to say about 2 or 3 things before I introduce our panel. First, this really is an exercise by the Department of Foreign Affairs and International Trade in what we're calling open policy development, which basically says that we don't have all the good ideas and that we should engage with all of you from the outset as we're developing our ideas. So our presence here and our co-hosting and sponsoring of this panel and others or global shift. And the shift is not simply from one set of states to another. That's a rather important shift, and I think a number of our speakers today will talk about that. Or from a set of one institutions to another. That's another important factor of the shift. But there's also a shift, I think, in what are the determinants of power and influence? And that is shifting in some ways from more traditional, conventional means to others. Whether that is the influence of ideas, or whether that is so-called smart power or soft power, whatever you would like to call it. And I think we're seeing some of that debate play out in a very literal sense on the streets of the Middle East and North Africa over the last few weeks in terms of power, how it's wielded, who wields it, and what is the impact, and also what is the response of the international community in a time of transformation. As we look at that environment, there are some who argue that the existing institutions of the post-World War II era are now suffering from a representation gap, but also a gap in terms of the issues and the themes that they are addressing. And I think that's something that our panelists will also be looking at. And others would argue, and this is I think where we get to the heart of the policy issue for us as practitioners, that the new institutions, the new forces of power and the new dynamics maybe threaten or jeopardize so-called middle powers like Canada and others and their influence and their ability to pursue their interests. Some, I hope, on this panel will argue that in fact, if we pursue the right mix of policies and build the right capacity, we can in fact have greater influence and ability to pursue our interests. So we're really looking forward to getting at some of that with the panelists. So with that
for activity, but at the same time, I think the EU shows that perhaps the traditional middle powers, at least from Europe, are a different breed today. And indeed, it's probably the country that Canada has seen sort of more classically middle power in recent years has been a non-EU country, Norway. So again, I think we have to sort of settle down and see whether there's sort of room, space for middle power. Certainly at the declaratory level there is. I mean, it's interesting in Canada, Prime Minister Harper, certainly a well-known speech in 2007, to the Council on Foreign Relations, sort of talked about the need to position Canada as a middle power in a different way, and we can sort of get on to this. And of course, even though he's not Prime Minister anymore, but still Foreign Minister, Kevin Rudd in Australia has been an interesting proponent of the middle power, talking about creative middle power diplomacy. And in some ways, I think in that regard, work on Australia, particularly favouring Labour Party activism on middle power is quite reflective. Different approaches on middle powers. One, of course, is somewhat, and maybe just to provoke Paul a bit. You know, can we? Not that he needs too much provoking, but careful. Can we see something like Afghanistan as sort of a super niche for middle powers? Certainly, I think if you look at Prime Minister Harper's language in 2007, Afghanistan seems to be a pretty predictable case where you would see sort of middle power, talking about middle power sort of, you know, stepping up, you know, delivering in terms of action, stepping to the plate, to use a sort of an analogy. And in some ways, of course, I think the subtext on this is the sense that playing and this type of super niche in Afghanistan is very different from these other niches of the past, the International Criminal Court, the landmines, small arms, child soldiers, and something. So I think there's an interesting narrative there. And even though the generals don't like niche sort of language, I think there's even a certain acceptance of, you know, if you're going to call it a niche and this allows the military to do what they want, they'll accept this type of translation from declaratory to operational. The other, and of course we'll hear more about this, is not so much Canada sort of out ahead trying to link declaratory to operational, but sort of a reactive approach to G20. And here, of course, the whole constellation between the G8 and the G20. Canada, of course, is in an interesting sort of position that you all know, sort of being a hybrid in this regard, having this G8 position still, you know, very different from sort of the classic middle powers. What is Canada going to do with this? We see sort of, in that regard, classic niche behavior, right, at G8. At least in some components of it, both in terms of...
Let me introduce our panelists. They will each have about 10 or 15 minutes to speak. If required, I will signal to each of you that you have 3 minutes, and then 1 minute. And then I'm not sure what form of power or influence I might use to get you to the next speaker. I'll innovate, or I'll adapt. Let me introduce our panel. Dr. Andrew Cooper was a distinguished fellow at the Center for International Governance Innovation. He is professor of political science at the University of Waterloo, where he teaches in the areas of international political economy, global governance, and comparative politics. He's a member of the International Advisory Board of both the Garnett Network of Excellence and the Hague Journal of Diplomacy, and he will cover in broad strokes, I think, a discussion around reform and innovation of existing institutions. Dr. Amitav Acharya is Professor of International Relations in the School of International Service at the American University in Washington, D.C. His previous appointments include as Professor and Deputy Director and Head of Research of the Institute of Defense and Strategic Studies at Nanyang Technological University in Singapore, as Professor at York University in Toronto, as a Fellow of the Harvard University Asia Center, and a Senior Fellow at Harvard's John F. Kennedy School of Government. And he was also Vice President-elect of the International Studies Association in 2008 and 2009. And he will cover regional governance and particularly a perspective on Asia. Dr. Yongrin Mo is a Professor of International Political Economy. He served as the Dean of Underwood International College at Yonsei University. He's also a Research Fellow at the Hoover Institution. And prior to joining Yonsei, he was an Assistant Professor of Government at the University of Texas at Austin. And he will be covering the evolution of the G20, amongst other things. Dr. Rohinton Medora is the Vice President, Program and Partnership Branch at the International Development Research Center. He joined IDRC in 1992. He's held the position of Assistant Professor of Economics, University of Toronto. He has also worked at the International Monetary Fund in Washington and consulted for the World Bank Economic Development Institute. And he will be speaking about networks, ideas, and innovation. And I think you can see the narrative coming together. And finally, our discussant will be Mr. Paul Heinbecker, who is a distinguished fellow also at the Center for International Governance Innovation. He's also the inaugural director of the Laurier University Center for Global Relations, a career diplomat who served in Turkey, Sweden, the Canadian delegation to the OECD, as in Paris, Washington, as ambassador to Germany, and most recently as our ambassador to the United Nations at a time when we were on the Security Council. He is also at CG. I guess I'm wondering whether it's a coincidence or not, Paul, but you are launching your own playbook, separate from RIM's playbook that's coming out. But Paul has just authored a book called Getting Back in the Game, a foreign policy playbook.
Of the initiative on maternal health. I mean, some controversy, of course, at home about how this was developed, but still, it does seem to be a classic niche, targeting an MGG that was sort of falling behind. With this, of course, food security as well, and it's interesting that Canada sort of pushes this at L'Aquila and puts money on the table for food security. The real interesting thing to me, though, and it fits into the introduction, is that this isn't sort of only the classic sort of club middle power. What, of course, is interesting in both of these initiatives is the Gates Foundation. And of course, if you didn't have the Gates sort of giving the niche sort of more, not just sort of credibility in certain circles, but of course sheer resources. And in this regard, I guess you could sort of ask the question, you know, very boldly. And we just had an IDRC supported it, a major conference in Ottawa on sort of new diplomacy on the weekend, on Monday and Tuesday. And I sort of asked, well, you know, if we're talking about a new diplomacy, do you have to actually privilege the Gates Foundation as a middle power, or at least a diplomatic power? I mean, they certainly have more resources than most middle powers. They have institutions, go to Geneva, see their building, bigger, and of course they outweigh the WHO in terms of spending in many years, and certainly all middle powers in terms of, or most middle powers in terms of spending. So certainly that's interesting. But of course with this, and we'll hear more on the Korean contribution, is that despite the sort of the unique component of Canada, what we're seeing is a new wave of middle powers. And this is sort of coming from a completely different direction than we would have seen in the past. Sure enough, Australia is still in the mix. But I think what's probably much more interesting in terms of the G20 is whether this sort of second layer of countries within the G20 can play a role very similar to the European middle powers in the past, some of the countries that we would have seen as sort of aspirant middle powers in the past. And of course Korea stands out, and in some ways their activities in the G20 in Seoul sort of play to the sort of niche component, development, but I think even financial security, safety net type of activities. And certainly I think in terms of their own sort of Sherpa diplomacy, quiet diplomacy, sort of you can see sort of Korea developing. I think even though I don't think psychologically Korea has been a middle power in the past, I think you're beginning to get a bit of the playbook of G20. Two big questions in terms of countries though. An article a year or so ago talked about a Kia group. And of course, this Kia group put Korea in the mix, but it also sort of added one old middle power, Australia, but of course a new middle power, an aspirant, Indonesia. It's interesting. I get the sense, and maybe Amitav will...
And that ends the plug for that book. But I'm looking forward to all of the comments and the discussion. So with that, Dr. Cooper.
I don't know if you're allowed to talk about your sort of first academic love, but thinking about middle powers, in some ways, this is my first academic love. In the post-Cold War era, I wrote a lot about middle powers. I wrote a book with colleagues, one of whom Amitav knows well, Richard Higgett, on relocating middle powers. I did a number of articles, one on spent too long on agricultural trade, on Cairns Group, NIO, fellowship in Political Science Quarterly, a number of other works that tried to sort of recraft middle power diplomacy away from some of the normative hangovers from the past, and trying to sort of do it a bit more conceptually, and trying to sort of balance sort of middle power overall, sort of stabilizer, even to some extent followership in the international system, with a range of styles. And I think this sort of led, I think, to some very innovative work that was sort of passed down to other people. The era that we're in now is very different. I think in the post-Cold War era, there seemed to be enormous space for middle powers. There didn't seem to be very many checks. There seemed to be also a lot of rising middle powers, countries that were very willing to identify themselves and to play by certain playbook rules. What we're seeing now, of course, is at least in theory and maybe in practice, squeezing of middle powers. We're also, of course, seeing rise of different acronyms, whether you call them BRICS, whether you call them, just a China-India consortium. But it's not just at the top that we're seeing this type of activity. What is really interesting to me is that we're also sort of seeing rising small powers. And I think even in conjunction to some of the more sort of central institutional components, we see sort of reactions by small countries. And I think the 3Gs are interesting, where you see, I guess, small in size, but certainly not small in resources and capabilities. Qatar, Switzerland, Singapore, and so on. So in some ways, it's a very good time to sort of see whether this type of squeezing sort of pushes middle powers away, or in a sense allows some sort of rejuvenation of middle powers in sort of a different way, perhaps in some ways less sort of club approach to middle powers, maybe to some extent much more sort of networked. At the same time, we should appreciate the difficulties. The EU sort of presents a different sort of structural concern, still some room for